All right, thank you so much for coming to the second event in the bookstore at Southern, our interview with Dr. Pennington focusing on his book, Small Preaching, and his writing process. So, Dr. Pennington, thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon.
It's great. Thanks for coming, guys. Appreciate it.
So I guess to get started, what made you, as a New Testament scholar, decide you wanted to get into the world of writing books on preaching?
Yeah, well, one book on preaching.
One book on preaching. I'm looking forward to more.
Yeah, maybe so. I already have the second title, Smaller Preaching, would be the next one. So I'm already thinking ahead. So we need to sell more copies of it so that we can get a second one. Yeah, my life has, for the last 25 or 30 years, been always intertwined between scholarship and the church. And I've spent different stints as a pastor, and in the last couple of years, I've really ramped that up again on the pastoral side, and I preach. We have a shared pulpit at our church, and so I've been preaching a lot and thinking a lot about preaching forever. I feel like actually every conversation I have in class ends up being kind of driven by either hermeneutics or homiletics. Like those are the two things that really, at the end of the day, are what drive me the most. Like, how do you interpret the Bible well, and how do you teach it and preach it to others? So this was kind of a natural extension for me to do that. But this particular book is, and maybe you'll ask some questions about that, it was the idea is to provide just small ideas to help you. And that was largely inspired, as I talked about at the beginning, by a book I read and used to use as a textbook for our PhD students called Small Teaching, which is the idea of just what are some little things you can do to improve as a teacher? So this book really is birthed out of this confluence or this Venn diagram of the many things that are in my life, which are thinking a lot about teaching, thinking a lot about preaching, and kind of bringing them together. So.
Yeah, the space that this book fits in is kind of these small tools that any preacher can kind of apply to their preaching. But kind of to step back, what are some of the influences of your own preaching and more bigger picture theories of preaching that shape the way that you do it on a weekly basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to admit, and it's a little arrogant that I've written a book on preaching when I've not really read very many books on preaching. So maybe that provided a fresh approach, or maybe I just accidentally plagiarized everybody. I have no idea because I haven't read any of those other books, so it wasn't intentional if I did. But so as I think about the influence on preaching on me, I mean, it all comes down to a teacher. And so whether you realize it or not, whoever you have for homiletics is probably going to have a big impact on you, for good or for bad. You might come out of your homiletics class and say, I don't want to do that. Hopefully you'll come out saying, I want to do that. For me, it was a guy named Mike Bullmore, who's a full-time pastor, but he was a professor at Trinity, a homiletics professor at Trinity back in the day, and when I was there in the 90s and early 2000 era. And he just had a huge impact on me by his model, his witness, his skills, and his encouragement, especially. I will never forget. I was a convert at age 18. I had no idea what I was doing, and I was in seminary probably when I was, it was a few years later, maybe 24, 25, somewhere in there, 26. And I remember in my first preaching class, he took me aside and said, in effect, this was really good, and I really want to help you get better, and just that encouragement, it was so meaningful to me that I just appreciate him. And the biggest thing he taught me was to think about sermons as a story, which I go like this. And if you've ever had me for Gospels class, I spend a lot of my time going like this because we're talking about narrative analysis, right? And that ended up being, and there's an essay in there about every sermon a story, just thinking about a sermon as I don't know if these are his words, these would be mine, as an event that has a plot to it, that has a tension that's released. And again, maybe I don't know anymore if that's what he actually taught me or if I'm just imagining he taught me that. But I do remember that was a very different approach than just kind of chink-a-chink, point by point by point. And I remember that having a big impact on me. So I mostly just honor Mike Bullmore as having a huge impact on me. And Greg Scharf, who I had there as well. And then models throughout the years. But I actually don't listen to a lot of sermons besides my own, to be honest with you, and the other preacher at my church. So I can't really identify what exactly, who the influences are fully. But yeah.
So with the title Small Preaching, it's 25 different essays on preaching. How do you envision the pastor uses this book? Is it one to be read straight through, to be digested, returned to? How would you hope a pastor would use it?
Yeah. Well, as I always say, I'm not so much worried about them reading as they are buying it, but just kidding. But I do hope they read it. And so, originally it was going to be, the thought originally was 52, and the idea would you kind of read one each week. As it evolved, I thought, this was enough probably, and maybe there would be a smaller preaching and I could do another 27, I guess, to make it work, or take 2 weeks off, another 25. But they are meant to be digested in, you can sit down. A lot of people told me they sat down and read it in an hour or something like that. And that's great. But the idea is that each one is taken and reflected on it and just try it. That's the idea. These are each things just to try. There's essays on like what to do in the first minute of the sermon, what to do in the last minute of the sermon, and just try it and see. So ideally, maybe read through it and then go back and just use some of the essays to try. Yeah.
The book is broken into the 3 main sections: the person, preparation, and then actual preaching. Could you speak a little bit to the band of brothers method that you highlight in the book?
Yeah. That's got an interesting story to it. At the group of churches I'm connected with here in Louisville, Sojourn, in an earlier iteration, when it was one church with multiple campuses, built into that was this idea that all the preaching pastors would get together each week and discuss the sermon, and all the campuses were doing the same text. The sermons were different, but they would discuss them, and there were even interns that would provide like PDF of the commentary stuff. It was super helpful, and I got a little taste of that. I wasn't one of the main preachers, but every time I preached, I got to be a part of that. A few years ago, that actually changed a little bit because of some various issues, and so we haven't really had that as much, except for more informally. So the different lead pastors or preaching pastors often share their sermon manuscripts and ideas by email with each other during the week, so we don't have a meeting currently. But the idea has always impacted me, that there's so much benefit in sitting down with other people and just talking through the ideas and wrestling with it together. Now we have a new version of it at my church. Every Tuesday at lunchtime, a group of us get together just at my local church, the musicians who write the liturgy and the songs, the tech people, one guy from that, and then Pastor Kevin and I. And we sit down every Tuesday at lunch and we review the past service, what went well, and then we spend and what didn't go as well maybe, and then we spend a fair amount of time reading the passage together for the coming service, and just it's open game. Anybody can share any thoughts they have, and it is so good. I mean, it's so great to hear from different people what they're hearing in the text and to get ideas. It's super stimulating. So I think you could do it locally with a group of people, but what I'm encouraging the book is that pastors connect with other people, even if you're especially if you're in a rural community, you don't have anybody nearby. Obviously, you can do it digitally now as well, and sharpen each other, plan sermon series together. There's no reason to do this kind of Lone Ranger preaching and this Lone Ranger idea.
Yeah, this helpfully moving past one man and one Bible to one sermon and kind of going beyond that.
If I might say more about that, I've been thinking more about this because at our church we've intentionally moved towards a shared pulpit. So we share 60-40, somewhere in there. And you have to have people that can get along and don't feel competitive with each other, which we don't, which is great. But the more I've thought about it, I've thought, where did we get this idea that one person is supposed to preach every week? I mean, I know that's kind of a sacred cow to even challenge that, but where did that come from? I don't think you find it in the Bible. Not that the Bible gives us all the prescriptions on how to do church. It doesn't. But even the idea of having elders that are able to teach, I think underneath that is the idea that probably from the earliest days, multiple people would teach. And at some point, it became, I think probably pretty late in church history, maybe with particularly educated people or particularly skilled people, it became about the person. But isn't that our problem? And if you're listening to the Mars Hill podcast like everybody else, or just think of any of the celebrity pastor problems, a lot of it has to do with one person who is a charismatic figure kind of runs everything. And, you know, I really come to believe that's not best for the church. It's not best for the pastor. And so I know for many people, they wouldn't be able to have a shared pulpit based on your locale, et cetera. But if you can't do that, at least get some help from other people in your preparation, I think.
Yeah.
So
what's so cool, I think, about the Band of Brothers idea is it's not an opportunity for the pastor to be lazy in his preparation, but really to sharpen and create something beautiful with the input of other people, which with some of the things that have gone on recently, I think you're very clear this isn't copying someone else's sermon, but this is allowing people to come into the creative process of sermon formation.
Right. Yeah, plagiarism is obviously bad, and I mentioned that in there, period. And the reality is, I'd recommend everybody read Austin Kleon's Steal Like an Artist. Is a great little book about this, that there's also nothing new under the sun, to channel some Ecclesiastes, that the reality is we're all dependent on other people. It's just a matter of citation of it is what the issue, but the idea that we all are needing other people's ideas, the idea that you're just sitting there making it all up is foolish, really. So.
Well, in Small Preaching, the book is full of metaphors and comparison. One of my favorite was the iceberg metaphor that you used. I was curious if you could just explain that to those who haven't read the book, and then maybe unpack how you, as someone who is a Matthew expert, don't make it feel like every time you step into the pulpit you have to tell everyone everything you know about the Gospel of Matthew or whatever you're preaching.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so this again came out of teaching first and then applied to preaching, but the idea of an iceberg is, and I did a little research on the nature of icebergs, which is interesting, recommended. It's kind of interesting reading, actually. There's a difference between North and South Pole icebergs, so there's your little teaser in case you're interested in learning more about, just like penguins and polar bears are never together. You got that, right? Okay, maybe not. You need to look that up as well. They're not with each other. Anyways, so the iceberg idea is that, you know, if you think about three kind of models for how someone could show up in teaching or preaching. One would be just this ice flow at the top where what you see is all that the person knows, right? And that's going to be kind of a thin and shallow kind of preaching or teaching. What probably most seminary people do and younger preachers do is they have an iceberg, but it's like there's a little bit below the water and then there's this mountain above the water. And what that means is you're probably sharing too much and saying too much. Like you're sharing, you do have some depth of understanding and this mountain of understanding, and you haven't learned to trim it down or to cut it down. The real power of an iceberg is that there's a little bit above and there's this massive amount underneath. Now, this analogy is a little weird because icebergs are mostly negative, probably in our mindset. So it's not meant, sink the ship of your church with an iceberg. That's not the point. The point is that there's the reason an iceberg on the top, it has a gravitas of what people do not see. In other words, the power and the mass of the power of an iceberg is mostly what you don't see. There's a small part above the waterline, and the submarinal part is what the below the water part is much larger. And that is the idea that in the pulpit, you need to have prepared, you need to have a gravitas of your understanding, but what you actually share has to be a small percentage of that. Otherwise, you're just overwhelming people. And so that's the main idea of the iceberg, is learning to have deep knowledge, but to translate it into real life in a practical and accessible way. And for me, that has been, I feel like I've done that pretty well for a while. I feel like I'm actually getting a lot better at that even more recently. And the kind of the other side of that is that I say this in class a lot, I feel like I don't really understand a text, even a text I've studied very in-depthly, until I go to preach it. Because something happens when you're forced to think about like bringing this down to a point of clarity. So it's not, my struggle in preaching for Matthew, which we did for a few years, was not, I have so much to say. It was more like, I've had all these thoughts about this text, but I really need to get down to the bottom of what this is saying, like who God is for us in Christ and what this is saying about me. In fact, the two big questions I always ask, often explicitly in a sermon, is what does it say about God and what does it say about humanity? And that has been the power for me, and that's why I love preaching so much, because I take a text that I've studied a million times. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's the heart of it that only preaching makes me see.
Yeah.
So.
Is there any ever regret or sadness of like, oh, I wish I could share more with the congregation, or is the distinction between preaching and teaching kind of how you separate or keep yourself from bringing too much into the sermon?
I think my regrets on my sermons, which are weekly, are that I wish I would have gone for the heart even more, and I wish I would have spent more time getting in my preparation, getting to the heart of it. I feel like I still, well, and this is mostly my wife telling me this, and she's right, that I still said too much, actually. So my regret is usually that I said too many words. Yeah. And again, my good wife, to whom the book is dedicated, is sure to remind me of that every week. And she's great because she's a real person who's highly intelligent but not theologically educated. So she's like this perfect person for me, and who really is a heart-oriented person. To say, yeah, you said a bunch of stuff, but what are people really going to go home with? And so that's where my regret is, usually that I've tried to say too much.
Yeah, I think that concept's so helpful for seminary students, like myself included. There's so much we learn in the classroom that doesn't need to make it into the sermon.
The cutting room floor. Yeah. I don't know if I talk about this in the book, but I say this in class a lot too, that, you think even a 3-hour-long movie will give you the director's cut of whatever. Even a 3-hour-long movie, that's months of shooting. Months of shooting. And almost what makes a movie good is the cutout. What's cut out is what makes it good. A good director cuts 95% out of what they've filmed. And if you think about your sermon that way, you don't want to not film anything, the analogy being you don't want to really not study and say, hey, it was a simple sermon. But you also don't want to produce, in effect, a 36-hour film, right? By analogy, what you want to do is have a succinct 2-hour film that was based on thousands of hours of footage, and that's the other analogy you could use with the iceberg about what a good sermon really is. It's a refinement process.
Another aspect of this book and your own teaching that I've always found so helpful is the vulnerability that you share with the this sermon sucks.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the chapter on that. Walk us through kind of the development of that process. And I think as young preachers, that's helpful to hear someone who's 25 years into this, that you still feel that and how to kind of push through those feelings.
And because I'm trying to mature, I changed it to stinks instead of sucks. But thanks
Sorry.
for busting
Oops.
me. I usually do say sucks, right?
I Penningtonized it.
Right, exactly.
He doesn't say
really
stinks.
That's true. I would say sucks usually, but it stinks. The sermon stinks. So that's right. The idea is, I remember as a very young preacher having these panic moments, usually on Saturday night, of thinking I had my sermon down and thinking I knew where I was going. And then just looking through it again and trying to finish it and realizing this is not working. This is a horrible feeling. And that, what I found is that stinks. It really does stink to have that experience. But that's an absolutely necessary experience to writing a great sermon. And it turns out to writing a great book or writing a great article or anything, you have to come to this point where you recognize its problems and fix them before you get up in the pulpit, right? And it all relates to this larger issue of what we call the creative process, that whenever you're creating something, and sermon preparation is a creation, it's being a sub-creator. Whenever you're creating something, that involves a very painful process because you're taking something that's inside of you and putting it outside of yourself, which is a beautiful thing, and it's a gift you're giving, but it evokes a lot of vulnerability and insecurities. Every artist feels this. And so to just kind of embrace that that's part of the process of preaching, when you feel that way, it doesn't mean you're not called to be a preacher. It means you're doing the sacrificial work you have to do to give to someone else. You are going through this painful process of realizing this is horrible, and I'm horrible. I'm a failure. I can't do this. And so just to embrace that process is a huge part of what it means to actually to be a good preacher, I think is the main idea.
Yeah, it's a real experience every week of sermon prep. Yeah.
Me too. Yep.
One last concept of the book before we kind of transition more to your writing process. You talk about snack writing and the preparation process. How did you develop that way of phrasing it, and what does that look like for you, kind of your weekly or monthly sermon preparation?
Yeah. So the idea there is that you need to be aware and learn a way to take notes and keep ideas and do some writing on the sermon all along the way, like whatever you have, a week or 5 days, or maybe sometimes if you get ahead, a couple months, that you're constantly thinking about it. So you spend a little initial time getting things going, and then you think about it and then record any thoughts you have. And so currently, I just made a recent switch to using an iPad Pro to do this, but I would typically do it in handwritten. And I would just stay aware of the text. And then when I think of an illustration or an idea or a concept or a way to reform the moves of the sermon, I would write them down and maybe even sketch it out to a paragraph level at that point. And that's so much better than waiting till your 3-hour block or 6-hour block and trying to knock the whole thing out. You're just not going to be as productive, and it's not going to be as creative. And so the idea is do a little bit regularly is much better. And it kind of relates to some dietary principles that, you're actually better off health-wise eating a bunch of small meals than you are like gorging, just because of the way your digestive system works, et cetera. And so the idea is do the same thing with sermon writing, write little bits here and there. And so like just today, I was sitting down with somebody and I already have several pages of ideas about a sermon coming up, but I took a bunch of more notes. And so then when I go to sit down, I'm not just creating from scratch. I've got 20 or 25 pages of various ideas, and then I just need to move them around and write it. So that's the idea.
That's really helpful. Yeah. Well,
that's a good segue to writing.
Yeah,
actually.
exactly,
yeah, right.
exactly. Well, there are a lot of boring books on preaching. I've read a lot of boring books on preaching.
Maybe that's why I haven't read them.
But, but thankfully, this is not one of them, and
awesome.
That's not just my opinion. All the reviews that I was able to find about this book speak to your creativity. Right. The book is full of metaphors and different really helpful comparisons. So could you just speak to your kind of the creative writing and your ability to actually accomplish writing a book that is unique and creative?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad. Thanks for the encouragement. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. Wow. So there's a lot there. This has been a journey myself over the last 15 or 20 years to learn to live in an academic and theological world as really a creative person, I think. I'm an Enneagram 3 in a 1 world. That's how I often think of it, if that means anything to you. And that has its joys and its trials as well. But I think the idea is to just embrace that, again, this is a creative process, and to maybe the simplest way to say it is constantly push yourself to come down the ladder of abstraction. And to give credit where credit's due, Amy Kreider, who used to teach here and run our writing center, is this dear, wonderful person. I learned this from her in some seminars she and I would do together on academic writing. She would always talk about coming down the ladder of abstraction. And that means going from abstract ways of talking to concrete ways of talking, right? And that is the making of great speaking and great writing in any venue. And the problem is that all of our education teaches us to think in abstract terms, but then to speak in abstract terms. And that's why most professors and most seminary students really do suck/stink at preaching, because you're being trained in a register of conversation, and you're reading a bunch of stuff that's way up there at the abstract level, which is beneficial, but you've got to translate that down to the concrete. So just give you one little example just from one of the other staff members at my church, so I mentor, and he preached just a couple weeks ago a good sermon on, and he had some great examples of not even consciously of doing this. So at one point he said, that neighbor that you have, that neighbor you talk to in the street, has he ever seen your couch? And that's such a good example of a concrete image, rather than saying that neighbor that you talk to, have you ever talked to him about the Lord, or have you ever talked to him more personally? You hear that? That's still kind of in this abstract level, talk to him personally, but I say, has he ever seen your couch, or has he ever sat on your couch? That concrete image does something different if you can pay attention to what happened in your mind and in your body. Actually, it triggered your visual cortex more clearly, and it was a much more powerful experience. And that's just one tiny example off the top of my head. What I work at very diligently in sermons and in teaching even is to constantly say, okay, I can think abstractly, but that's not going to help people. Bring it down. And that's what a good illustration does. A good illustration takes something that's abstract and makes it concrete. And I would say that's one of the most important things that especially seminary students need to learn is come down the ladder of abstraction to concrete.
Yeah.
So.
In this book, you use metaphors like icebergs that we've talked about, small ball, baseball, encaustic, sculpting.
Sculptic painting. Right, yeah.
How are you kind of having these ideas come into your head? Is it from like breadth of reading? Are you always thinking about writing as you're just kind of traveling around the world?
Yeah.
How does all that work its way into a book?
Yeah. I am hungry for beauty. That should, you can put that on my tombstone.
Yeah.
Right? Hungry for beauty, or hunger for, he was hungry for beauty. I guess your lies. And then I record them when I can in Evernote or whatever way you want, in my iPad, whatever it is. So I think I always love this phrase about C.S. Lewis that I hope to half aspire to, is a mind awake. Just showing up in the world in a way that's curious and hungry and always on the lookout for beauty. To channel a little Rich Mullins here for a minute, he sings, there's so much beauty around us and just two eyes to see. In other words, that's the Rich Mullins kind of spirit that I love, which is recognizing the world is beautiful. There's so much beauty and goodness in the world. I wish I had more than two eyes to take it all in. And if you can adopt that way, and you can inculcate that, you can get better at that, you can develop that by exposing yourself to beauty and beautiful writing and poetry and art and experiences. Learn to slow down and look for beauty and inhabit the world that way, and then write down the stuff that comes to you so you don't forget it, right? And so that, I don't know how to answer other than that's just how I experience the world.
Of being
I read
in
a
the
ton
world.
of fiction. Yeah. I read a ton of fiction. That's a big part of it, is that I'm always, and I read a lot of poetry as well, so.
Very cool. Well, to move more concrete in the writing process, in the last 18 months, you've had 3 books come out.
Yeah.
So this is just the latest, Jesus the Great Philosopher, and a New Testament textbook. So how are you able to be so prolific in your writing? I've barely have written 2 papers in that time. So
right. Well, yeah. Yes. I'm glad. Not about the papers, about the. Yeah, it's funny. I feel a lot of guilt and shame because those 3 books that came out, what most people don't realize is that by the time a book comes out, you probably finished writing it almost a year before, just because it takes a long time for the editorial process, and you were involved in it, but the production and all that kind of stuff. So those 3 books represent a particularly productive time that has largely been replaced with golf now.
Well, let's go back to that time.
And my wife, if you guys know Stephen Pressfield, he's a great fiction writer. If you've read like Gates of Fire, and so if you ever read that, he's really great. My wife just sent me when I was on the plane recently. She was reading this book called The War of Art by Pressfield, which is about the creative process and how difficult it is to make things, to be creative. And Pressfield it was in the foreword or something to it. It had this line about how golf is like one of the greatest procrastinators for any creative people. I'm like, whoa, too close to the bone here. But it's true. Yeah, I mean, I am very productive, and I think it's what I always say to PhD students who, especially I've talked a lot about these issues with, is we always vote with our clocks. We always vote with our feet. You will get done what you value the most. And if you are not writing, then, or you say with exercising or whatever, that doesn't mean you're not able to do it. It means you don't prioritize it. I mean, it's as simple as that. Like a lot of the great writers throughout history have worked, full-time jobs as bank clerks or whatever. You think a lot of the great Victorian writers. And in fact, the reality is that the life of leisure that we all dream would result in productivity are the least productive people. Maybe you know the old saying, if you want to get something done, give it to a busy person, because someone who's their engine is running and their wheels are turning, that's what you have to do for yourself, because those are the people that go somewhere. And so if you, not you, but if you generally are struggling to be productive, I would first look at your priorities. I'm not saying that there aren't life circumstances. There are life circumstances that make it more difficult. Maybe a chronically sick child, or, there's a million things. I get it. So I'm speaking of generalities here, but we will get done what we value most. And so for me, I've really decided as a part of my calling that not only do I want to write, but I feel like God's called me to do so. And so those books reflect different amounts of time. The Reading the New Testament as Christian Scripture, that was a 7-year project, so that was a long time coming. It just happened to come out the same month as Jesus the Great Philosopher, which is probably about a 3-year project. Small Preaching was even shorter, so they just all kind of happened to hit at the same time and made it look like I'm this amazing, productive person. But, you're one of the things I always say too is keep stuffing the pipe. That is that, if you want to open the spigot and get this thing called a book that you've written, that's amazing. Well, that's a 18 to 100 month process, right? And so if you want that to be happening on the other end, you got to keep, I don't know, what am I doing? I'm not putting water into a pipe with this. I'm not sure what's happening in this metaphor here. So all my metaphors aren't as good as others, right? But something's happening. I'm putting... Water's going in.
Is it steam in the pipe?
I'm not sure what's happening. So talk amongst yourselves and figure that out. Pray about it. But somehow you got to keep putting water in so that it'll come out, or whatever might be flowing through a pipe. Good things that might be flowing through a pipe. So you just have to keep producing, recognizing that it's a long-term process. And in the case of these 3 books, it really was multiple projects going on at once. They just happened to all kind of hit at the same time. I mean, I've got other things coming out too, but that was just a particularly sweet season. My colleague, Dr. Allison, the same way, he's producing books like every few months now. But the reason is because for 30 plus years, he's been teaching and thinking and writing, and they're not all, he didn't just sit down and write one book and then started another one. I'm sure he's got multiple things going on, and so do I. And then just as you get older, just more comes out if you keep being productive, because you just got more maturation and time. So,
yeah.
Did that answer your question?
Absolutely.
I don't know what the question was now. I got so caught up in my
to say helpful
metaphor.
things. That's the whole point. So I think it was
That's right.
helpful.
Okay, good.